ask you one more question related to these texts from that West Asia. Most of the reading lists of departments and institutes which happen to offer this program on world literatures, they do not include any text from West Asia except, of course, Orhan Pamuk's. And don't you think the Muslim world is rather underrepresented in these curricula? Or do you see any kind of a conflict of interest here at play?
Yeah. No, I don't see a conflict of interest, but I am very aware of the fact that the curriculum, after all that has been said and done, is still biased by and large towards European and North American literatures. Having said that, Orhan Pamuk, I don't think is the only author. If you look at these representative anthologies, the Norton and the Longman, they've gone to great length to actually widen our access to texts that are believed to be representative from the Persian tradition, from the Arabic tradition, from Sanskrit, but Pamuk, of course, is a major presence amongst contemporary authors. But if you go back to the classical period, you would actually discover very good samples of Arabic poetry and Persian poetry and of texts in Sanskrit. Turkey, of course, thinks of herself as a country that is divided between Europe and Asia. But I'm not entirely surprised, because in China they also refer to Turkey as part of West Asia. And looked from here, of course, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But no, I don't think there is conflict of interest, and I don't think decisive in this. Religion does play a role in this, but more, at least as I see things, in the sense that we actually neglect religion, not just Islam. We neglect religion generally in our present Anglo-Saxon understanding of world literature. We bracket out religion. We work with a very secular notion of world literature at present, forgetting two things. First, that historically religion has played a huge role in shaping up these large realms of shared languages, shared religions, which sustain world literature before globalization. And secondly, we forget that, particularly now, in the 21st century, religion is very much back, disrupting this Western secular order and neglecting it and not entertaining this necessity to actually integrate religion into how we think about world literature is something we do at our own peril.
So the themes of cosmopolitanism and transnationalism, they seem to be your current interests. And how would you prefer to put these themes across to your students? That is the methodology that you adopt here. Would you prefer them to embrace this ideology of cosmopolitanism and shape themselves into cosmopolitan citizens? Or you expect something else?
Yes, I think there are forces larger and stronger than even the instruction in the classroom, that would shape the way these students grow and develop. But it's been an enormous pleasure to spend time with them, to hear their views on these very important subjects. And they've been absolutely excellent, very proactive, very acute and alert and willing to contribute to the discussions, and extremely curious and open-minded. I really had a great time with them, and it continues also tomorrow. But you're right to point to the fact that cosmopolitanism, in a sense, is the product of Western culture. And it does have an ideological baggage which people tend to neglect sometimes. And it's a word that surprisingly doesn't travel very well in non-European languages. In China, if you try to translate cosmopolitanism, you would get an equivalent which retains the component cosmos, but entirely omits the other component, the polis. So that has to tell us something about the fact that cosmopolitanism originates in a set of European concerns at a particular historical moment. We're talking here particularly with reference to the modern political doctrine of cosmopolitanism, which begins with Kant and his project of eternal peace, because I've always insisted that we should carefully distinguish between two cosmopolitanisms. One is what I call cultural cosmopolitanism, and the other is what I call political cosmopolitanism. And they don't always overlap. They are very distinctive doctrines.
Which do you think is easier to practice?
I think they actually all come with their baggage, and they also both come with their benefits. But in class we were discussing an essay which was focused on the role of national intelligentsias in resisting attempts to forcefully westernize non-Western cultures. And we talked about why the intelligentsia is particularly susceptible to this. Why is it that the upper class in India embraced and sustained English? Why is it in War and Peace you can find entire passages in French, or in Coleridge's play, The Glenbyre Family, you would find entire passages in German, in conversations between people whose language is not German. It's Serbo-Croat, or was at the time. And we arrived together at this conclusion that the intelligentsia, due to the nature of its preoccupations, the nature of its work, its loyalties are always divided. Loyalty to the nation, but also loyalty to this sometimes invisible community of other intellectuals, other scholars, other writers, without whom this entire process of research and teaching would not be possible. It would collapse. And even if it didn't, it wouldn't be achieving its very best. And it would be to the detriment of both those who are involved in it immediately and those who are meant to benefit from it.
So, do you think that this concept of cosmopolitanism could be used to further discussions of literary texts or courses, related to world literature, study of world literatures. Is it possible to?
Yes, I think so, and there is already important work in this field by colleagues in the United States. Rebecca Wolkowitz comes to mind as only one example in Britain and elsewhere. But we need at the same time to be careful not to conflate cosmopolitanism with universalism, because globalization, I think, tempts us to do this, and it does so frequently. But we need to remain aware of the fact that cosmopolitanism, actually, unlike universalism, and against the grain of the powers of globalization, insists on cultural difference being preserved and cherished and embraced rather than simply tolerated. Yeah? So this link between cosmopolitanism and world literature, we need to be careful to make this argument in a nuanced way that differentiates sufficiently, and that doesn't simply produce a leveled, indiscriminate playfield in which texts simply circulate in a single language that forgets its own past, forgets the fact that even English is different in Britain, in Australia, in India, in the United States, with a different history, sometimes with a different set of functions.
So retaining pluralism is something you...
Yeah, I think this is very important. And also retaining this sense of things not always being equivalent, across borders. Retaining this notion of difference that cannot be dissolved, even in the age of globalization. And it is, of course, another issue that globalization is now facing challenges. There are calls, if not to retreat, then to revisit some of the dogma associated with this seemingly unstoppable march of globalization. But this is another set of questions.
Yeah, you just now referred to the French passages in The War and Peace. So that reminds me of, that brings to my mind The Wasteland. How would you like to look at this text, you know?
You know, even high modernism
because it has passages from different languages, including Sanskrit, German.
It does. And
French.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, that even texts we associate with high modernism, which is so constitutive of a Western tradition, and still so dominant in the classroom when you teach English literature of the interwar period, and of course before that. Even these texts are texts that actually are wonderful examples of how these high points of Western modernism are imbued with polyglossia, are imbued and sustained by impulses from other cultures. And Eliot is not the only example. Look at of course, at Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound's work cannot be understood and appreciated without the presence of Chinese culture. and the impulses he draws from China in his recreation of Chinese poetry. Because what he does in Cathay and in other pieces is not really translating Chinese poetry. It is recreating it in this idiom of high modernism. So both Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot give us a very good clue to look into these sets of work, not singularly through the Western prism, but through the prism of the crossroad and the cross point, where we have a real encounter. And the irony, of course, is that for a long time, for considerable time, because of Ezra Pound, in the West, scholars would think that Chinese literary modernity in the teens of the 20th century, and particularly in the 1920s, was wholesale the product of Western penetration of China's culture. The truth is, some of what gets exported to China and reaches China and is somewhere in China had already incorporated the impulses of Chinese culture from much older times. Yeah? So it's not as if the West directly impacts on non-Western cultures. If we looked at Pound in particular, it is the case that what arrives in the East and proves to be seminal there sometimes has already been shaped also by impulses coming from the East. And this is very important to appreciate and understand.
You're right. Actually, over the last few years, many Indian writers, especially writing in English, they have been producing some very best fiction in the world and have, of course, brought the Booker several times. And what is it about these books, that is, for example, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, or take Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things? What is it that appeals the global audience about these books? Or let us say the readers back home in Bulgaria.
Oh, it's very nice of you to refer to Bulgaria. I hesitate whether to go into this question of home, because this is part of the work we've been doing with the students, reading texts by writers in exile or on exile and on cosmopolitanism, and trying to see how this notion of home is not immediately available, and it's sometimes complicated, and it's sometimes simply not there as a reference point. And so we'll probably leave aside this idea of Bulgaria as home. And I don't exactly know how a Bulgarian audience would respond or has responded to these two novels. The other difficulty in all this is that if one is invited to comment on global responses or Western responses to these texts, there is always the danger of beginning to inadvertently either essentialize them or orientalize them or both. Rushdie's position, of course, is different in that respect, because he's been a traveler and a border crosser. Many in the West, of course, when they read Midnight's Children, of course they were fascinated by these stories of dramatic reversal, but also of patience, of love, of miracle, of something which we would refer to before Rushdie, probably more difficult, so after him, as magical realism. And as for the second novel, I think very, very fascinating novel, seemingly along the lines of a family novel. Extremely dramatic, tragic in many ways, and yet also spilling over into conventions that a Western reader might recognize sometimes as family saga, pressing on buttons that are sometimes close to the melodramatic. Yeah, it's a beautiful mix of all these of all these different strands that make it so rich. But it's very difficult, and it's in a sense not the right thing to speak for a global audience.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Tihanov. It has been quite rewarding and wonderful to conduct this interactive session, and I'm sure that this session will be of very great use to all my faculty and students.
Thank you for a really rewarding dialogue. I'm very much in your debt, and also grateful to everyone here at Hyderabad for your hospitality.